hull of the Mary Rose came to the surface in October 1982, after 437 years underwater. It lies in a haze of spray in its final resting place in Portsmouth Naval Dockyard. What happens next? What did the excavation reveal? What will analysis of all the finds and the hull itself both tell us and teach us about our Tudor ancestors?
We are now standing where the bows would have been of the Mary Rose, looking towards the stern. When you first look into the Mary Rose, it looks like a lot of beams sticking out. But if you look more carefully, you will realise that these are actually the beams that hold the deck flooring. It is lying at an angle of 60 degrees. So if you could imagine that she was turned upright, where the letter B is actually the keelson, that would be in the bows of the ship.
If you can imagine on that weather deck where mariners, all sorts of types of soldiers like pikemen, archers, with their cannon and so on, all on that deck waiting to board, because the type of warfare they indulged in then was to get close grip, grapple and board. Now for preservation and conservation, the timbers are continually sprayed with chilled fresh water, which keeps the timbers from drying out and also repels bacteriological infestation. The humidity in here is kept at about 95% and the temperature about 5 degrees centigrade. And the spraying could go on for up to 15 years before it's decided that it's safe to turn the taps off.
The raising of the Mary Rose was a great national occasion and the culmination of more than 15 years of intensive effort.
How do you feel? How do you feel?
Oh, it's still very mixed, John. It's still very mixed.
Yeah, mixed why?
Well, she was ours when she was down there. Now she belongs to everybody. But look at those deck beams. I mean, that's a damn strong ship, isn't it? It's a hell of a ship. When you think of everything she's gone through, not only during the excavation, all those years of excavation, but now the recovery, and still those deck beams haven't collapsed. It's totally remarkable.
In the evening, after the lift, the Mary Rose came back to Portsmouth, where she was built. A few days later, she was put to rest near Nelson's flagship in an old dry dock. When the dock was pumped empty, and the Mary Rose was eased into position and moored for the very last time, it marked the end of the longest and biggest underwater excavation ever seen in Great Britain, and the beginning of a whole new era.
It's a wonderful thing to have the ship ashore here so that we can look at her in a more relaxed atmosphere than in that murky visibility underwater. But the difficulties of working in the hull cannot be overemphasized. It's a wet, slimy, slippery structure. We have to crawl around inside her, still wearing dry suits, still with safety lines on. And our task now is to complete the recording of the hull and propose a method for turning her vertical. We can then replace inside the ship all of the timbers that we took out underwater. All of the decks were dismantled. The cabins were taken to pieces, timber by timber, and now they all have to be replaced inside the hull so that the general man in the street can understand her and enjoy her. There's at least 3 years' work to complete this. Thousands of people, some 50,000 in the first couple of months, came here. And it was quite noticeable that when they began to walk across the bridge, they were perplexed, they were puzzled. They stood with blank faces and they just looked. And then they turned their heads and they began to understand how the ship lay there. And you saw that puzzlement turn to what can only be called, I think, wonder. 99.9% of the public coming in say she is much bigger than we ever thought. I believe they thought we lifted a rowing boat, you know. But she does look very much bigger now in air. We'd all got so used to swimming around her in 3 minutes flat. And now she looks a very big vessel indeed. And I think at this present time, because we haven't interpreted the ship yet to the public as a working warship, it's simply a dramatic sense of achievement. And they come and they enjoy that.
Throughout the excavation of the Mary Rose, from the earliest days until the hull came through the surface, Chronicle cameras have always been on watch. The levels of skill and professionalism seen on this excavation have probably never been equalled before, at least in Great Britain. But there was a constant battle between the need for accuracy and care and the need for speed to ensure that the hull could be lifted before it deteriorated. The human bones from the wreck will be interred in Portsmouth in July to pay homage and due respect to the men who died on the ship. The bones that were found seem to represent the remains of about 200 men, a small proportion of the total number said to have been on board. What can they tell us about the age, height, health and strength of the men and youths on the ship? A freelance specialist, Anne Sterland, is examining and analysing the bones and their condition.
If we take these two long bones, which are femora, we can see that they look different. And they look different because the articular ends on this bone are present, but they're absent on this bone. This is because in young people and adolescents, children, these ends are only fixed, if you like, by cartilage, and this allows the shaft of the long bone to grow, which is how we grow taller. These ends fuse on to the bone, and they do so at certain ages which are different for boys and girls, which is why men are generally taller than women. And according to the condition of the bones, whether these are joined and present or absent or just joined, as in this case, so we can give an age range. The youngest that I've encountered so far is an individual aged between 12 and 15 years, and the oldest is somebody at a rough estimate in their 40s. Predominantly, they're in the age range 18 to 24 years, which is, I suppose, what you would anticipate.
More than half the men in the sample were between 5 foot 6 inches and 5 foot 8 inches tall. The heights reflect a fairly standard pattern, a pattern that might be typical of an English village even today.
Bone is extremely plastic. People never realise this, and every single thing that ever happens to us is reflected in our skeletons. It is a true record of all the things that occur to us during our lifetimes. For example, we have here a pair of matched tibia, which I suspect probably represent somebody who suffered from rickets at an early age, because as you can see, they are very bowed towards each other. And if we compare them, for example, with that one, there's quite a difference. It's also worth noticing that there's a difference in length, which represents a disparity, of course, in height. And this is another thing that we do. We measure bone length and then calculate stature. If we look at this pair of matched femora here, we can see instantly that they are very different to the others, because the head has slipped. This epiphysis, this loose end, which I was referring to earlier, hasn't fused properly and has slipped down the neck. So this man would have had both his thigh bones in that curious orientation, but he might well have not been aware of this condition. He might have had some stiffness, but he was relatively young, and so the degeneration would not have occurred until later. Equally, This is an example of a fracture. In our terms, an untreated fracture, probably a spiral fracture of the tibia. And if we compare it with this tibia, we can see that it is unnaturally inflated. I think so far we have 3 fractured legs and 3 fractured ribs. We have some very interesting spines. If we look at these spines here, we have, if we look at the back of them, a difference in the shape of the vertebral bodies, where we have a compression in the mid-spine. As we can see, these are nothing like as deep as these. And if we look on the bodies themselves, we have these impressions, which are called Schmerl's nodes. It can only happen when a person is very young and the intervertebral disc ruptures, and because it can't spread out from between the bones, it leaves an impression on the body of the vertebra when it's still in this very young and forming state. The Americans, interestingly enough, call this snowmobiler's back, and I think that probably bobsleigh teams and tobogganers have the same sort of anomalies these days.
Spinal injuries like that could have resulted from a fall from the rigging, or from a rash jump over the side of the ship into a longboat. It's impossible to be sure. Fish and animal bones were also found. The bones of these big North Sea cod were found together in one place on the ship. There were lots of them, all without their heads, as if salt cod was one of the items on the menu that week. There were also barrels full of beef. Jenny Coy.
This is the contents of one of the casks, and these are bones of cattle, so this was probably salt beef. And we have here the remains of at least 3 individual animals, which suggests that there were several being slaughtered and butchered at the same time. If you look at this picture, I've tried to show which parts of the skeleton are normally represented. Backbone, ribs, but we also have the shoulder blade and the hip bone and the odd elbow and kneecap, which were left joined to the muscle. Most of the meat is from backbone, and that backbone has been split down the middle. This is a thoracic vertebra, part of the backbone on the rib cage, and you can see that it has been cut down the midline. There are also cuts going across the body from side to side. And probably it was hanging from a hook. We know that because as you get to the tail of the animal, the midline cut goes off centre, probably as the weight of the side of beef pulled it over. It shows that the meat was probably put up in portions, and that the portions probably correspond with these rather regular lengths of bone that you have. This is a rib, and the lengths of these are fairly standard, from about 100 millimetres to 200 millimetres as we measure them nowadays, and chopped at each end, and this shows that there was some portioning of the meat. We're getting the impression that it was fairly standardised by this time. There aren't written regulations until 1565, where some papers have been found in which the weekly ration for each sailor is actually laid down, and these finds certainly show that something like this was already going on in 1545.
Sometimes the contents of the Mary Rose tell us something intimate about the lives of the men on board. A handsome sea chest was found on the main deck, close to a drinking vessel which held about a quart of ale. A few inches away were the bones of a little mongrel, which drowned while it slept curled up beside its master's fine possessions. The treasure of the Mary Rose is in the abundance and variety of the objects found on board. A man's foot, still inside his shoe with his bones close by, can tell us about his height and state of health, and perhaps what his job was on the ship. On land sites, leather objects are amongst the first things to decay and disappear. No one had ever seen a large group like this of shoes and boots and jerkins, all found together, closely dated in the same sealed context. This is unique evidence about how shoes and clothing were manufactured at that time. Marion Foster, a volunteer at the Mary Rose Trust, has studied the leather jerkins very closely. First, she draws the outlines of the garments, while they're wet, onto a polythene sheet, which forms a permanent record of the garment's size and nature. Her drawings show how they were stitched and sewn together, and whether the garment had been torn and mended. The jerkins shrink slightly when they've been conserved, but you can see many of the other details of the garment, including, in this case, the position in an inside pocket where a flea comb was once carried. In some cases, all the pieces of a jerkin were found together. You can see how it was laced up with leather thongs and how it was stitched. This man's pocket was inside his jerkin, like a poacher's pocket. Marion's polythene reconstructions are stuck together to give an impression of how they once hung and were worn. The intention is to recreate them in calfskin leather. The Mary Rose Trust will also make replicas of these big bronze guns and may be able to fire them off and test them. The sizes and types of the guns reveal a lot about Tudor ballistics and weaponry, and lifting them was a major challenge.
3 feet.
Up on the hook 3 feet.
And west.
And west. Stand by.
They were raised with great care and delicacy, not just because they are attractive and valuable objects, but to preserve as much information as possible. In this case, the whole of the wooden carriage was raised, together with the gun which it once supported, to allow ordnance experts to look closely at how the whole thing was constructed.
Let it come easy, Ali. Nice and easy.
Come in nice.
Keep taking it really easy, then.
3 guns were lifted in one day, on the 27th of November, 1981. Some guns were bronze, some were iron.
Walk your end for that for me.
12 were found in all, together with their carriages, as well as the small guns and firearms. The hand weapons, like this forest of pikes in what the divers used to call the pike garden, are even more of a revelation than the big bronze guns. Wooden weapons were thrown away when not needed. They have not survived elsewhere. Some of the longbows were found at action stations, beside the bones of men who might have been archers. Others were found in boxes, stored, as if to equip onshore raiding parties or for spares. Before the Mary Rose was discovered, almost no accurate information about medieval longbows was available. No one knew for certain how they were made, how far they threw an arrow, or how fast. The cache of longbows from the Mary Rose, 139 in all, together with the arrows found, will answer some of these questions. Margaret Rule.
Recovering the bows, no problem. Recovering the arrows, one heck of a problem. Those were made of yew, very strong, the arrows of poplar, fragile, as soft as butter. And we have recovered some 2,000 arrows with extreme difficulty. But now, of course, we have a very nice sample to study. There are details of the fletching to be recorded and understood. Some fragments of the feathers remain. And we are going into a whole program of experimental work to shoot replica arrows of the Mary Rose type, using newly made bows of the Mary Rose type, and then by a little bit of experimental archaeology, understand exactly what that archer was capable of on the main gun deck of the Mary Rose.
The bows were in marvellous condition when they were found. They were carefully dried and examined on the surface, and eventually they were taken to Instrom's laboratory near High Wycombe to test their strength and calculate their draw weight on a special rig. The results were disappointing.
The experiment at Instrom was brought about because the bows were obviously flexible. They could be strung and drawn, and this was somewhat remarkable. 437 years in the sea, and yet they were still fluid pieces of wood. I don't know whether it's the correct term, but they still had flexibility. And in the Instrom film, to see them strung and to see them drawn to their full draw length, capable of shooting a 30-inch arrow, was to me utterly and totally remarkable. And we notice how flexible 3 of the bows were. The 4th, of course, wasn't. The 4th one was stiff in one limb, and eventually it broke because it had been biodegraded. In spite of its external good appearance, microorganisms had degraded the interior of that structure. But I think one of the most glorious moments in 17 years was seeing that bow move in such a very rational way.
For the small study group that Margaret Rule had enlisted, the disappointment was that none of the bows drew the weight that a computer program had predicted. In theory, the Mary Rose bows should have drawn over 100 pounds. In fact, not one of them would give over 60. Because of this, the Mary Rose Trust asked a skilled bowyer, Roy King, to try to create bows like the Mary Rose bows using modern timber. These will be shot and tested later this year.
This is the first of the approximations that he's made out of very fine Oregon timber, very much to the specifications of the sort of mid-range of the Mary Rose bows. And this bow weighs 104.5 pounds at 30 inches, which is a very useful possible guide to us. The other branch of the research we can do with the approximations is we can shoot and shoot and shoot them. When we've got the arrows right, the weights right, the spine, that's the bendability of the arrows against the bow, when all those factors are right, then we can shoot ourselves blue in the face and come up with a lot more, let's say, approximate figures.
John Waller, a professional archer, has already been involved with Robert Hardy in testing the penetration power and range of longbows and different arrows. The various types of head have different properties. This will penetrate plate armor of the sort worn by a knight on horseback. What sort of arrows were used by the archers on the Mary Rose? John Waller has joined the study group.
The arrow which I have made is at the moment poplar, which it appears some of the arrows are. It's made to the exact dimensions. It's got the exact length of horn insert in the nock. The binding is the same. The arrowheads we're still working on, but this is an exact copy of a Type 16 arrowhead. We call it a Type 16 just to designate it from different arrowheads. I'll show you what it looks like on the thing. I won't shoot it.
Skilled archers could shoot 12 arrows per minute from the fighting tops on the masts of the Mary Rose. Behind almost every gunport, the divers found traces of archers ready to repel boarders. No one yet knows exactly what range they could shoot, but John Waller is prepared to take a guess.
I would think that 250 yards is a workable range, and I think that most of the fighting ranges would be about 200 at the most. I think that on the Mary Rose arrows, you're attacking men in riggings. You obviously don't shoot the ship because it's wood, and you're attacking men that are unarmoured, the men that make the ship function. Therefore, you're going for a light, long-distance arrow with a very naughty little head that they can't get out of their leather tunics and things, as opposed to some of the armour-piercing heads that we've used on previous chronicles for attacking armour.
Large artifacts like this chest are immediately recognizable. The contents, silt and fragments of leather, are much more mysterious. It was normal practice on the Mary Rose to take samples from chests and barrels, and from any obvious deposit of organic material that was located. These racks in the basement of the Mary Rose Trust building hold the thousands of environmental samples taken during the dig. Ian Oxley and his various volunteer assistants are attempting to assess the range of this material. No underwater site has ever been so thoroughly sampled. Through the microscope, Ian can see a fragment of some textile, a seed, and the corpses of 2 Tudor fleas, which confirm the need for all the flea combs found on board. The raw material of one of these samples looks like this. After much patient sorting and sieving, 1 4-litre container can yield a variety of materials, including samples of textile, perhaps from a garment or a stocking, profuse quantities of plant remains of various sorts, and many other curious items. Ian Oxley.
We only attempt very basic processing in this building to separate out the components, and then these are fed out to various specialists to give us identifications and interpretations of why those particular items are there. The information then comes back to us and to the archaeologists, and we prepare the excavation report.
Frank Green deals with the plant materials.
This work on the Mary Rose is really starting from scratch. We have some information from other wrecks in a European context, but we have no real idea of the type of preservation we ought to have encountered and the degree of preservation, the quantity of materials that might have survived. And compared with normal land-based archaeology, it is a completely different world. We have materials that are surviving here which we've never seen perhaps previously. On the table here, I've put out a range of the materials that we have recovered so far. We have pod fragments. These are in fact actually pods of broom or cytisus, and these come from several locations on the wreck. It may well just simply been to pack round objects. It may be that some of the stems were used for actually scrubbing down the deck, something of this order. The next range of material we have here consists of fruit stones. These are all prunus species, small plums and varieties of plum. We have a single apple pip so far from the wreck, and we also have grape pips, quite a range of evidence for grapes, including possibly pieces of the skin of grapes. The grapes and the fruit stones come from a location where they're obviously storing dried fruit in a basket, whereas the skins of the grape come from possibly the bottom of a barrel, which maybe even contained wine. We have a very wide range of straw material and other packaging materials from the wreck. The straw material can tell us an immense amount about the crops of this period. We're not certain that the crops were actually produced in this country. They could have well been imported from abroad. We're not absolutely certain where the ship was victualled from. But it does tell us exact varieties of rye and barley being cultivated at this period and being used on the ship. This, in fact, is a sample of peppercorns, black pepper, which have subsequently, after recovery, been dried out. These have been found in several locations on the wreck. These particular ones come from a container in the barber surgeon's chest and are really very well preserved. Pepper was used for a variety of purposes, medicinal, herbal, and of course it was used as food flavouring. And it may well be that the average seaman even had a small quantity of pepper to flavour his rather boring food. Many of the plant remains actually still contain something of their original smell. It does appear that the essential oils contained in pepper and other plant materials has survived, and so that in fact actually it's quite remarkable that you can pick up material that even has a scent about it of the period we're dealing with.
The barber surgeon's equipment was one of the most extraordinary collections of material on the ship. It consisted of 64 items, together with medicines, pre-prepared bandages, and ointments which were probably used for ulcers and skin disease. The bleeding bowl and razors suggest that rough and ready surgery was carried out on board. This syringe was for the treatment of venereal disease. The Mary Rose was not a treasure ship, but 27 gold coins were found on board, mostly singly or in small groups, as if they were personal possessions. 27 gold coins was quite a lot of money to find on board a ship that was on its way to battle. But in February this year, the Sunday Times claimed that the Mary Rose had been plundered, that widespread theft had taken place.
Much of the best stuff went straight out of the back door. It was a treasure hunt, a free-for-all.
We have independent corroboration that artefacts from the Mary Rose found their way to the London antiques market.
There was mismanagement, in my view, and no real supervision.
The story about the pilfering, I think, is one of these wildcat stories which grows. It becomes a fairy tale. Because it was brought to my attention at a very early stage, we immediately asked for a police inquiry. The Trust asked for a police inquiry. They carried out a very thorough investigation. They say there's not a shred of evidence of anything recovered from the Mary Rose being offered for sale. So I think we can dispose of it. I like to think that everybody who worked there was motivated for the same reasons as the archaeologists. I'm sure I'm right. It was such damned hard work, you can't see anybody working there for the sheer chance they might find one coin and be able to pocket it.
Let me put two more points to you about that. Did you feel the Sunday Times story was fair?
Oh, what a comment on journalism. I don't think it recorded all of the facts as were known at the time that story was printed.
What did people who've been working on it voluntarily for years, giving their time and giving their energy, what did they think about it?
The volunteers were very upset, and quite rightly so, because the smear went right the way across everyone who'd ever dived on that site, not just the professionals. The smear on the volunteers is very regrettable. And I found that when I was lecturing around the country, I had groups of volunteers registering their dismay that an operation they'd been very proud to be associated with was smeared in this way. And their concern was very real. Let's hope it's now understood that it is just a story.
It was a volunteer diver who first saw the timbers of the Mary Rose above the seabed in 1971. Since then, hundreds of other volunteers have spent thousands of hours underwater, researching and helping to unearth the Mary Rose. It was the hull itself, the ultimate artefact, which intrigued and inspired them. By 1976, when this film was made, a major exploratory excavation was underway, with a new type of underwater camera.
Well, our main problem here is extremely poor visibility. We can't see what we're doing, so we're measuring the ship and we can't fill in the detail because basically it's difficult to see it. So now we're filming with this very low light camera which reveals detail basically that we don't see. And so I'm hoping that we can project these films against our drawings and put in the detail that we're missing in the manual drawings. It's as simple as that. It gives us detail.
In a way, it's a substitute for the human eye.
It's a substitute. I'd like to do all the recording photographically, do photogrammetry, but that's impossible on this site at present. This is an aid to put some more little tiny details onto our overall plans.
Is this going to speed up the process of the whole excavation of the Mary Rose?
Oh yes, that's the whole point.
To what extent?
Well, it's work which would perhaps take a week to do, can now be done at home or in the office in a day. We can do the overall drawings and then put all the details on from these photographs.
Are you now then willing to put a firmer date on when we might see the Mary Rose up out of the water and ready to be viewed by all and sundry?
Well, if we get support in this sort of technological support, which will speed it up so much. Remember, we had acoustic sonar survey last autumn, which helped. It speeded up things. Now we've got photographic survey. If this carries on, I think we've got 2 more years' work, and then we shall be able to say, yes, the Mary Rose can be lifted, or no, she should be left on the bottom. It's just 2 seasons more work to do.
By 1980, Margaret Rule and the Mary Rose Trust had taken the decision to lift the hull. Full-scale excavation was underway. One of the archaeologists' main tasks was to survey the ship and to establish precisely how much of it remained. By the end of the dig, they had examined almost every inch of the structure. This was relatively easy when the ship was empty, when all the silt had been cleared. But until the excavation reached the bottom of all the trenches, it was much more difficult. Each archaeological season fed in more information about the structure, as new areas were cleared and new trenches were driven from one side to another across the site. Not everything that had to be removed was as soft and malleable as the grey silt which filled the inside of the ship. In 1981, the Mary Rose Trust recruited a team of specialist divers who used air hammers and other tools, sometimes even small explosive charges, to break the adhesions which bound the metal guns to the decks. This was the beginning of the build-up towards lifting the hull. During 1982, the archaeologists only conducted one limited nighttime diving season on the wreck. Their work was almost done. Most of the hull was empty. Most of it had been thoroughly surveyed. The professional divers were starting to tunnel underneath the hull, and new areas of the ship were slowly and carefully revealed. It was crucial to check the exterior dimensions wherever possible. It was also necessary to drill long holes through the thick timbers of the hull, so that the Mary Rose could be suspended from the large frame above her by several hundred steel wires. Lifting her like this was the best way to avoid the hull being crushed when she was eased off the bottom. All this took months of working, night and day, to prepare the Mary Rose for the eventual lift. Amongst the divers and the archaeologists, all the uncertainty and worry, all the intricate preparations were forgotten at the moment when the Mary Rose came back to the surface.
There is the first sight of this flagship of Henry VIII. It's the first time we have seen this in 437 years. What an amazing sight.
Lifting the Mary Rose has created as many problems as it resolved. How do you conserve the ancient timbers? How can you manipulate the hull in air? Mark Jones, a wood scientist, has been appointed to probe into the condition of the timbers to discover how strong the wood is before they turn the hull vertical and reconstruct it.
It's important that we try to be as non-destructive as possible. And as a result of this, I've chosen to use a pylodyne, which measures wood density. It's a rather simple instrument which fires a very fine needle into the hull timber. The further the needle penetrates, the greater the level of decay. Pylodyne measurements are taken at 50mm intervals, and the results obtained provide us with valuable information about the condition of the hull timbers. In general terms, the condition of the wood is very sound. However, there are 50 or so timbers within the ship which have undergone extensive decay. These are not recent decay pockets and were probably present during the life of the ship, and these require very careful and regular monitoring to prevent the spread from these regions into the more sound timbers.
Initially, the scientists worked wet inside the hull in extreme discomfort. Now they can turn the sprays off for 60 minutes at a time. The archaeologists have also undertaken a survey, plank by plank, to tell them something about the working methods of the people who built the ship.
320. We go over the concretion.
Andrew Fielding, the Deputy Director of Archaeology, began his survey work underwater with his colleague Adrian Barak.
So now starting at the top stringer.
Now in the hull on the surface, they're verifying the details.
At last, we've just started our survey work of the ship. We had a lot of work that had nothing to do with archaeology when the ship first came ashore, of course. The whole of the inside of the ship had filled with silt between the end of the excavation and the recovery. So we had to remove some 1,500 gallons of mud from the inside between all the frames, remove that from the environment of this dry dock, whilst all the contractors were putting in the mechanical and electrical services around us, providing us with lighting or mist spraying to keep the ship in an ideal environment. So we spent some 6 or 9 months doing a lot of routine work to make sure the ship was kept in the best conditions before we could begin the real archaeology. Nobody knows anything about how these ships were built. There are no plans, no drawings, no models. She had a very long active service, and in 1536 she was rebuilt. Whether or not this was complete or was only partial, we hope the answers will come out of this very detailed survey work. As the mud has been cleaned from the ship, we've been able to see things now the ship's in air that we weren't ever able to see underwater. The carpenter's marks on certain timbers. Marks which have had sediment in the very fine joints between the timbers, and as the sediment has washed out, we've been able to rediscover patches and repairs in timbers that have been so superbly done you can hardly see the join. Well, underwater we weren't able to survey the whole of the ship. There were lots of areas that it was totally impossible to get at. There were over 3,000 bricks forming part of the galley, which took an awfully long time to excavate because we had to understand completely how that galley had been built before we removed it. So there was a huge area between the keelson and the bottom of the orlop deck that we were never able to survey. The measurements at the bow and the stern of the ship were within 10 centimetres. Because we were able to set up very precise datum lines, the ship at these points is not very wide. It's only some 8 metres wide and 3 metres deep. In the centre section of the ship where we are now, the depth is over 6 metres and some 11 metres wide. As we weren't able to erect static datum lines underwater because of the general safety hazards of divers who might swim into these lines and get caught down there, and because of the seaweed which would catch and drag and move them about, we were only able to lay temporary lines purely during the extent of our dive, perhaps some 45 or 50 minutes, and relay these at the beginning of the next dive. Our task now is to go back and resurvey and check our underwater measurements to see how accurate we were during our underwater survey work.
The Mary Rose was a substantial ship, about 32 metres by 11 metres, with high castles at the bow and stern. Everything found with her was both practical and professional. This gimbaled compass, with the other navigational tools, confirms that the ship was a seaworthy vessel, capable of weathering big seas. For navigation and for chart reading, some form of timekeeping is essential. Some of the crew carried a pocket sundial. Some of the equipment, like this bosun's call or pipe, remained standard issue in the British Navy until the 20th century. All the goods on board are both serviceable and workmanlike, as well as having a certain elegance. Every man had a dagger to cut up his standard portion of meat or fish. They carved and decorated their tools and possessions, as sailors always have done. The ivory manicure set might have belonged to a man of fashion. The pomander with fragrant herbs inside it was swung about by its fastidious owner to freshen the air between decks. Were all Tudor ships as richly equipped as this one? All these artifacts and many more will be on display when the Mary Rose Trust opens its new museum in Portsmouth Naval Dockyard. Work has been going on for several months. The museum will open in June. it should be one of the most exciting museum displays in Great Britain. No doubt the guns will be the high point of the exhibition. This was the first major artifact ever found in 1970. And this was the last, the ship's bell, found just a few weeks before the hull was raised. Like everything from the Mary Rose, whether great or small, it contributes to our understanding of the Tudor Navy and Tudor life.